Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take those complicated stacks of research you send us, the conflicting studies, the history, all the expert opinions, and we try to distill it all into clear, actionable knowledge.
Today we're tackling one of the most intense medical and social debates on the planet, male circumcision. Our listener wanted a clear, just a dispassionate breakdown.
And it's a big one. We're trying to balance proven public health needs against, some really serious ethical questions about bodily autonomy.
And then there are these highly contested scientific claims about sexual function. It's a minefield.
It really is. And just to set the stage, let's start with the sheer scale of this because it's genuinely surprising. Male circumcision is one of the world's oldest and most common surgical procedures.
Absolutely. It affects roughly a third of all men globally, and it's been performed for centuries for religious, cultural, and now increasingly medical reasons.
That huge prevalence, that history, it really explains the intensity, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, this isn't some niche surgery. In some places, it's the standard of care. In others, it's seen as ethically unacceptable. Our mission here is to sort through all that, through the conflicting data from global health organizations, the big medical associations, the latest research, so you can walk away feeling thoroughly informed.
Okay, let's start with the clearest part of the science, the medical case. Here in the U.S., the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, they put out a major policy statement back in 2012.
Right, and it's still hugely influential.
So what was the nuance in that shift? What did they actually say?
The wording was incredibly careful, which, it tells you how much conflicting data they had to synthesize. They basically concluded that the health benefits of newborn male circumcision outweigh the risks.
Okay, benefits outweigh the risks.
And this is the key part. Based on that, they said the procedure is medically justified for families who choose it, which means it should be accessible and insurance should cover it.
But wait, this is where it gets interesting. They said all that, but then they explicitly did not recommend it as a routine thing for all male newborns.
Exactly.
So why that compromise? Why stop short?
That's the vital distinction. The AAP is saying, yes, the benefits are real, they are quantifiable, but in the low-risk environment of the United States, the size of those benefits isn't big enough to justify a universal recommendation.
So it shouldn't override personal or ethical objections.
Precisely. It keeps it as a valid medical option without making it a public health mandate.
Okay, so let's get into those quantifiable benefits. What's at the top of the list?
Well, the most immediate one is a big reduction in urinary tract infections, UTIs, in the first year of life.
How big of a reduction are we talking?
For an uncircumcised infant, the relative risk of getting a UTI is about 5 to 10 times higher than for a circumcised infant.
5 to 10 times? I mean, that sounds huge, but isn't the absolute risk for any baby boy getting a UTI already pretty low to begin with?
That's exactly the tension. You're right. The absolute risk is low, maybe 1%, but a UTI in an infant can be very serious. It can lead to kidney scarring, which can have lifelong consequences. So even though the chance is small, preventing it is a pretty substantial benefit.
Got it. Okay, what about longer-term prevention after infancy?
Then we start to see a clear protective effect against penile cancer. It's a rare cancer, but almost all cases happen in uncircumcised men.
The numbers on that are pretty dramatic, right?
They are. The lifetime risk is something like 1 in 600 for uncircumcised men versus maybe 1 in 100,000 for circumcised men in the U.S. It's a massive drop.
And I saw something in the source materials about prostate cancer as well. A 15% risk reduction if it's done before first sexual intercourse. But you don't hear that one talked about as much.
Right, and that's because that data is mostly observational. It's not as robust as the data on, say, STIs. It suggests a link, maybe something to do with inflammation, but it's not strong enough to be a main pillar of the argument.
So the gold standard for justification really comes down to STIs.
Yes, that's where the conversation shifts to a global scale. The evidence here is, well, it's pretty much indisputable, especially from these big randomized controlled trials in Africa.
Right.
Circumcision reduces the heterosexual acquisition of HIV by about 50 to 60%.
50 to 60%? That's profound.
It's a huge deal in high prevalence areas. It's why organizations like the WHO strongly endorse it as a public health intervention.
What's the biology there? Why the inner foreskin specifically?
It's all about cellular biology. The inner surface of the foreskin is packed with immune cells, Langerhans cells, dendritic cells.
Okay.
And those cells are the prime targets for the HIV virus. They're the entry points. Plus, The environment under the foreskin can help the virus survive. So removing that tissue literally removes the most vulnerable access point for the virus.
And it's not just HIV.
Correct. It also offers moderate protection against HPV, which of course reduces the risk of cervical cancer for female partners, and some protection against herpes and syphilis. And then there's the simpler stuff like hygiene. It just makes cleaning easier, reduces smegma, and gets rid of the risk of conditions like phimosis.
Okay, but before we move on, we have to talk about the risks. They're not huge, but they're real.
Absolutely. Complication rates are low, especially when it's done in the newborn period by a trained professional. But you have risks of bleeding, infection, and in very, very rare cases, serious damage. And those risks, even if they're small, are precisely why we get into the ethical fight.
Right. We've laid out the benefits, they're quantifiable, and in some places they're critical. But they're mostly preventative.
Prophylactic.
And removing healthy tissue from a baby who can't consent, just for prevention. That is exactly where the battle lines are drawn.
That's the core of it. We're leaving the world of medical data and entering the world of human rights, of bodily integrity. And if you look at Europe, you see a totally different consensus.
Like in the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany. Their medical associations see this very differently than the AAP.
Completely differently. They argued that since the benefits aren't immediately therapeutic, the patient isn't sick right now, there's no justification for doing it without a clear medical urgency.
So they're looking at it through the lens of what? Primum non nocere. First, do no harm.
Exactly that. First, do no harm and individual autonomy. The baby can't consent to having healthy, functional tissue irreversibly removed. To them, that's a violation of their bodily integrity.
I read one source that called it absurd and insane, comparing it to amputating a pinky finger, just in case. It's a harsh language, but it really drives home that ethical point.
That language comes directly from the autonomy argument. Critics also say, look, all those preventative benefits you talked about, UTIs, STIs, you could achieve those with less destructive things.
Like proper hygiene education or condoms or vaccines.
Right, so why perform surgery?
This feels like a classic public health dilemma. You're sacrificing a small amount of individual autonomy, the right to an unaltered body, for a larger collective good, like disease prevention.
That's a perfect way to put it. But the critics also push back on the context of that public health data.
What do you mean?
Well, they point out that the really dramatic HIV data comes from those high-prevalence African trials. They question whether that evidence is even relevant to a low-incidence Western country like the U.S.
And the argument there would be that in the U.S., things like safe sex practices and education should be doing the heavy lifting, not circumcision.
Exactly. They'll point out the paradox. The U.S. has a high circumcision rate, but also a higher HIV rate than, say, Japan or Sweden, where circumcision is rare. They argue that proves that behavior and societal factors are way more important than the foreskin.
So, in that context, removing tissue for preventative reasons becomes ethically questionable.
That's the argument. Public health necessity in one place, a violation of bodily integrity in another.
Okay, this brings us to what is probably the most complex and emotionally charged part of this. Sexual function. The data here isn't just mixed, it seems to be completely contradictory.
Yeah, this is where we have to really slow down and look at what kind of evidence we're talking about. The argument against circumcision usually starts with the idea that the foreskin is this, richly innervated, specialized sensory tissue.
With things like Meissner's corpuscles, the fine touch receptors.
Right, and that it provides a gliding mechanism. The claim is that removing it permanently changes the sensory landscape.
And we have some pretty shocking survey results that seem to back that up. What about that Danish survey?
Yes, the Danish study. It surveyed thousands of people and reported that circumcised men were over 3 times more likely to report frequent difficulties with orgasm.
Wow. And it wasn't just them, right? Their partners also reported problems.
Huge problems. Women with circumcised partners were over 8 times more likely to report painful intercourse dyspareunia and over 3 times more likely to report general sexual function difficulties.
Those are staggering numbers. So how do we square that with everything else?
Well, this is where you have to dissect the methodology. That Danish survey gets heavily criticized for bias.
Selection bias and recall bias.
Both. Think about it. In a country like Denmark, where routine circumcision is extremely rare, most men who are circumcised had it done as adults for a medical problem, like a tight foreskin, phimosis.
So the problem might not be the circumcision itself, but the pre-existing condition that made the surgery necessary in the first place.
Exactly. It's a massive confounding variable. And that's why, when you turn to higher quality systematic reviews, which combine the results from lots of randomized controlled trials, you get the opposite conclusion.
What do they find?
They find minimal or no adverse effect on sexual function, sensation, or pleasure. Some of the best studies even found self-reported improvements in satisfaction.
So we have subjective surveys from places where it's rare showing huge negative impacts versus these big systematic reviews saying there's no overall negative effect. Why do scientists put more weight on the reviews?
It comes down to reliability. Histological studies, for instance, show that the glands and the underside of the shaft are where most erogenous sensation comes from, not primarily the foreskin. And the randomized trials, they minimize that selection bias. They give you a much cleaner causal link. For most men, the high-quality evidence says function and pleasure stay strong.
Okay, let's look at one specific part of that. Premature ejaculation, or PE. There was a study from China on men who had adult circumcisions.
Right, and that study is fascinating because you see a clear before and after picture. What they found was, initially, at 3 months after the surgery, men actually reported worse ejaculatory control. Their time was shorter.
Shorter, why?
The theory is temporary penile hypersensitivity. The glands is suddenly exposed to constant friction for the first time, and it's overly sensitive for a while.
So it gets worse before it gets better.
That's what the data suggests, because by 6 to 12 months, the trend completely flipped. The circumcised men reported significantly longer times. I think it went from about 1.5...
Along with better control and satisfaction.
Exactly. The study strongly suggested that long-term circumcision is associated with a reduction in the risk of PE.
Which ties right into that stamina theory. The idea that constant gentle friction from clothing causes the glands to keratinize, to thicken a little bit, which dials down the sensitivity.
Precisely. That reduced sensitivity might lead to more stamina or a longer duration. It's important to add, though, that these studies found no real link between circumcision and erectile dysfunction, or ED.
Okay, we've covered disease prevention, the ethical critiques, and this really contradictory data on sexual function. It seems like the final decision really just hinges entirely on context.
It has to. You have to separate the discussion. In high-risk environments, places with a lot of HIV, it's a validated public health tool that saves lives. The individual risk of the procedure is tiny compared to the population-level catastrophe of an epidemic.
But in low-risk places like the US or Europe, the math completely changes. The benefits are there, but maybe not enough to be the deciding factor. The decision becomes about personal risk tolerance, culture, ethics.
And that's where the partner's perspective, while not strictly medical, becomes relevant to satisfaction. We see that some partners prefer a circumcised penis, often citing hygiene or lower infection risk, and that peace of mind enhances pleasure for them.
While others prefer an uncircumcised penis.
Right, for the softer feel, the gliding mechanism, sometimes for gentler penetration. Of course, lubrication can solve a lot of friction-related issues either way.
So when you boil it all down, what's the consensus conclusion for a parent or an adult who's considering this?
The consensus, if there is one, is that it's a highly personalized, informed choice. You have to weigh the solid, but mostly preventative, medical data against your own religious, ethical, and cultural beliefs.
And for adults, even with that positive data on PE, it's not recommended as a standard treatment just for sexual enhancement?
No, absolutely not. It's an irreversible anatomical change. It demands full consideration. The most sophisticated take seems to be that while it undeniably alters sensation, the type of sensory input changes, for most men, it doesn't seem to impair the ability to have a satisfying sex life.
It's almost like the psychological factors, whether someone believes they've lost something or gained cleanliness, can play a bigger role in their satisfaction than the physical change itself.
I think that's a huge part of it. It's a remarkable field. The evidence on disease prevention is clear, but the evidence on sensation is subjective, and the ethics are just deeply divisive.
The AAP's position really reflects that, doesn't it? The benefits are real, but not so overwhelming that they trumped the right to an unaltered body.
Exactly. That distinction, that the benefits are quantifiable but not strong enough for a routine recommendation, creates this immense pressure point. It forces us to decide which value system we're prioritizing.
Which leads directly to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with.
If a procedure has significant measurable public health benefits, but at the same time it violates a fundamental ethical principle, bodily integrity, when it's done on a child without consent, which side of that equation does a society prioritize? the collective health outcome or the individual's autonomous rights.
That is the ultimate tension running through all of this.
I see.
Thank you for walking us through this incredibly complex and controversial stack.
My pleasure.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and ready to approach this topic with confidence. Until next time.